Opening the center for piece development, this establishes immediate control and hints at an early queenside initiative. Opening the path for the bishop, this prepares a solid pawn structure and a flexible development plan. Asserting central influence, white immediately challenges black's pawn formation, preparing to seize key squares. Embracing a fianchetto, black concedes central space for a diagonal bishop, aiming for queenside pressure. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure, this move prepares for a later advance, but at the cost of immediate development. Developing the bishop to exploit the long diagonal offers immediate pressure and sets the stage for queenside expansion. Developing the knight to c3 strengthens the center and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Developing a knight to its natural square, this move prepares for castling and contests the center's influence. Disrupting black's queenside expansion and gaining central space, this decision forces an immediate strategic recalculation. Embracing the center with this pawn thrust opens lines but sacrifices pawn structure, creating a dynamic, sharp positional struggle. Reinforcing the central pawn chain becomes crucial as white prepares for potential pawn pushes, securing his king and preparing piece development. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares to activate the bishop and contest central space. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop adds a new dimension to kingside pressure. Developing the bishop to the kingside fianchetto now solidifies your central pawn structure and prepares for potential kingside expansion. Solidifying the center and preparing for a kingside attack, this bishop now eyes a long diagonal. Developing the bishop harmoniously solidifies black's pawn chain, aiming for a harmonious setup before any tactical clashes commence. Securing the rook on the b-file prevents any immediate queenside pressure while calmly preparing for queenside expansion. Anchoring the knight here solidifies the e5 pawn and prepares a potential kingside expansion, creating a formidable central barrier. Expanding along the queenside, white pressures black's pawn chain, aiming to unravel the kingside structure or create queenside space. Finally, the monarch finds sanctuary, a crucial step in preparing for the ensuing skirmishes in the center. Pressing the center with e4 creates a central pawn chain and aims to restrict black's development and piece activity. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure preemptively addresses potential future attacks along the g-file or through discovered checks. Securing the king by castling kingside is a natural and fundamental developing move. Challenging the d4 pawn's dominion, this bishop repositions to exert pressure along the long diagonal and prepare for a potential queenside expansion. Shifting the queen to this square prepares a queenside pawn advance, potentially targeting black's bishop or preparing for future expansion along the b-file. Shifting the king away from the potentially vulnerable d-file offers passive safety, though it sacrifices some attacking momentum. Exchanging the dark-squared bishops can ease white's queenside pressure, but it leaves the c4 pawn potentially vulnerable without immediate support. The knight's retreat to g8 signals a shift, perhaps to reinforce the kingside or prepare a later repositioning, potentially aiming for the f6 square. Unleashing the knight towards the kingside, a bold territorial claim. Black repositions the knight to e7, a less direct square, aiming to support the central pawn chain and prepare for potential queenside expansion or a shift to the kingside. Developing the bishop to a square that doesn't immediately contest the central tension, but prepares for potential fianchetto exchanges or pressure along the long diagonal. This knight repositions, aiming to bolster the central pawn chain and potentially launch a kingside attack. White launches a bold pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially exploit the open b-file. A cautious repositioning, aiming to free the knight for more dynamic participation on the kingside, though it sacrifices central presence. Establishing a solid dominion over the c-file now promises to pin down black's queenside pieces. A surprising retreat, seemingly ceding vital central squares and delaying development, yet perhaps a subtle preparation for a long positional battle on the queenside. Liberating the queen's bishop opens lines and prepares for a central pawn advance, creating dynamism. The queen's repositioning unifies the forces and eyes the c-file, promising greater activity and potential breakthroughs. Cracking open the queenside with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's solid structure and create immediate play. Opening the queenside for counterplay, but it might invite immediate pawn storms. Breaking open the c-file creates dynamic imbalances and demands careful calculation from both sides. Unleashing the queen, black aims to disrupt white's central control and exploit the open files created. Sharpening the central pawn structure now demands black's immediate attention to prevent white's pieces from dominating. Seeking counterplay on the queen side, black ignores white's central pawn push and potentially weakens their king's defense. Reclaiming the open file offers opportunities to pressure black's queenside pawns and disrupt their coordination. Attempting to break the queenside blockade, but leaving the queen's pawn vulnerable. Reclaiming central presence, the knight eyes the weak pawn chain and potentially prepares a kingside leap. Initiating a blockade on the queen side, aiming to constrict white's maneuvering space and stifle any pawn advances. Disrupting black's pawn structure with this advance creates immediate pressure along the c-file, potentially isolating the queen. Unleashing the kingside pawn, storm aims to destabilize white's central control. The bishop's repositioning aims to support the central pawn push and challenge the dark squares, potentially freeing the knight. Opening the center with this queen sortie might expose your monarch to unforeseen threats. Focusing pressure along the b-file aims to dismantle black's kingside pawn structure and exploit the open c-file. This pawn thrust seeks to unravel the queen side and create space for black's minor pieces, though it risks weakening the b5 square. Securing the queen's influence and preparing for pawn breakthroughs. Seeking to exploit the open c-file and launch a counterattack, black boldly repositions the queen to a more active, although potentially exposed, central square. Initiating pressure along the open d-file, white aims to activate the rook and potentially exploit black's slightly passive queen. The queen retreats, a defensive pivot, to avoid the immediate threat of the white knight and await white's next strategic commitment. A calculated gamble to disrupt black's queen and pawn structure, potentially opening lines. Returning the king to a slightly more shielded square anticipates potential knight incursions and strengthens the kingside defense. Unraveling the queenside tension, this exchange simplifies the board significantly, potentially opening lines for white's rook. A dynamic reshuffling of black's rook to embrace an active role on the open file. This repositioning of the rook to the 7th rank aims to strangle black's queenside pawn structure and restrict activity. Embracing the doubled pawns after the exchange, black seeks to activate their scattered pieces on the queenside. Centralizing the knight after the pawn exchange solidifies control over key squares and prepares for activity on the now open files. Recapturing with the rook reestablishes active defense on the 2nd rank, aiming to prevent further pawn advances. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain aims to restrict black's counterplay and gain breathing room for white's rooks. Reorganizing the king ensures it avoids the open files and central tension, preparing for the upcoming endgame fight. Preparing to maneuver the king to safety, bolstering central control and freeing up potential pawn pushes. Unleashing the knight's potential, this advance disrupts white's queenside while preparing to exploit the open g-file. A centralizing knight retreat prepares for potential breakthroughs and reinforces the pawn chain's integrity. Bringing the knight to f5 invigorates the kingside, eyeing the weak pawn on g3 and preparing for potential tactical skirmishes. Securing the kingside pawns against black's advancing knights creates vital breathing room. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal offers potential activity and reassesses black's attacking chances. Reactivating the rook to challenge the open file and bolster central influence. Reorganizing the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to reinforce the queen side. Shifting the knight towards the kingside aims to support a potential kingside pawn push and improve piece activity. Exploring the center with this knight opens up a dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Liberating the dark-squared bishop, this exchange aims to simplify into a more favorable endgame for white. Reclaiming the pawn breaks open the e-file for potential counterplay. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure aims to prevent black's knight infiltration and prepare for future central expansion. Attempting to reposition the bishop to a more active square, but opening lines for white's king hunt. Dominating the 8th rank, this rook asserts control, preparing for potential infiltration or offering crucial support to the kingside. The rook's central placement now forces a critical exchange, simplifying the board into a pawn-heavy endgame where pawn structure becomes paramount. Repositioning the rook to the now open file pressures black's weakened queenside pawn structure. The bishop bravely ventures forward, aiming to disrupt white's control over the central squares and potentially reignite attack possibilities. Asserting control over the center and preparing to swing the knight to a more active outpost. Reclaiming the center and opening new avenues for the rook is black's intent, a sharp counter to white's central dominance. Solidifying the king's position is paramount after the exchange, prioritizing safety over immediate pawn aggression. Reactivating the king through the center is crucial, aiming to support the central pawn majority and prevent white's pawn advances. Repositioning the rook to the 8th rank asserts dominance over the open file and pressures black's defenses. Repositioning the king to a safer square amid the unfolding complications on the board. Unleashing the rook to sweep across the 7th rank, black's king now faces inescapable pressure. Relocating the king to the queenside allows it to evade the direct attack and potentially offer support for a pawn advance. A decisive exchange clears the path for the remaining rook to dominate the 7th rank and pressure the enemy monarch. Releasing the central pawn tension offers a path towards simplifying into a more active rook endgame. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank creates immediate pressure, aiming to infiltrate black's weakened pawn structure. Shifting the rook to the 4th rank aims to harass the white king and disrupt its defensive structure. Securing the central pawns after the pawn trade will be key to leveraging white's material advantage. Introducing the knight to the central e-file reclaims some lost space and prepares for potential knight outpost ideas. Trading knights now simplifies things, creating an advantage by eliminating a black defender and opening a path for your rook. The pawn's drive forward promises a new dimension to the struggle. Activating the monarch into the fray now offers better prospects for defense. Exploiting the discovered attack creates a decisive material advantage as the king is exposed. Sacrificing material to open a diagonal for the rook offers a glimmer of hope in a losing position. Exposing the king to a cascade of checks, black's choice invites a swift and decisive end to the struggle. Fortifying the passed pawn's advance, the rook now protects the crucial 7th rank, aiming to restrict black's counterplay. Challenging the rook's dominion on the 7th rank, the king seeks refuge and opens avenues for peace activity. Repositioning the rook to attack the 7th rank solidifies control and pressures black's weakened king. Capturing the pawn on a4 allows the rook to become more active on the queenside, aiming to penetrate white's defenses. Initiating a decisive pawn push to finally crack open the defense. The rook's journey to d4 seeks to establish control on the open file and create counterplay. The pawn's determined march to promotion suddenly gains unstoppable momentum.